When Edwin Callum died in October after 30 years as the last working miller in Harn County, his family divided what he'd left behind in less than a week. His daughter Claire took the house. His son Paul took the savings account and the truck. Nora, the one who had moved back at 38 to care for both parents through 6 years of slow decline, the one who had given up her position at the university and her apartment and the particular life she had been building, received the Callum Mill on the creek property, a rusted water mill assessed at $2,200, with a broken wheel and a leaking mill race, and a deed that nobody else had wanted. She drove to the mill on a cold November morning not to stay, but to begin the work of letting it go. But when she finally cleared the last wheel, pulling the years of vine and debris from the timber housing around the wheel shaft, working her hands into the gap beside the headrace wall, she found something her father Edwin had sealed there, something he had placed in the wall of his own mill before she was old enough to remember him as a young man, left for the one person he trusted to find it. The last year of Edwin Callum's life was bad in the specific, grinding way that the final years of a slow illness are bad. Not dramatic, not sudden, just the daily wearing down of a man who had been strong his entire life and was not accustomed to needing help. He had raised 3 children in a farmhouse above a creek in the Appalachian foothills of western North Carolina, run a water mill for 30 years, driven 3 counties in any direction to repair mill equipment when his neighbors needed it, and done all of it with the self-contained competence of a man who had never once considered asking for assistance because the thought had simply not occurred to him. By the time Nora arrived, at 38, he was already past the point of managing alone. She had been in her second year as an archivist at a state university, good work, the kind that suited her, quiet and systematic and concerned with preservation. She had an apartment she liked and colleagues she respected, and a general sense that her life had found its shape. When her mother called to say that Edwin had fallen, and that the fall was the second in 3 months, Nora drove home for a weekend. On Sunday afternoon, standing in the kitchen she'd grown up in, watching her father move from the counter to the table with the deliberate care of someone navigating uncertain ground, she understood that the weekend had become something longer. She called her sister Claire that evening. Claire lived in Charlotte, 2 hours away, with a husband who traveled for work and 2 children in middle school and a schedule she described as impossible. She said she was so sorry. She said she would try to come when she could. She said Nora was so good with these things. She called her brother Paul. Paul was in Atlanta, 4 hours. He said Dad had always been stubborn and wouldn't Nora be better positioned to. He didn't finish the sentence, but Nora understood the sentence. She had always understood sentences like that one. She gave notice at the university. She packed her apartment into a storage unit that she paid for with her savings. She drove back to Harn County and moved into her childhood bedroom, which still had the curtains her mother had sewn when Nora was in middle school. The years that followed had a texture she couldn't have described to anyone who hadn't done something like them. Not dramatic, not heroic, just the daily accumulation of necessary things. She took her father to his appointments, cardiology, then nephrology, then the general practice doctor who was managing the overlap between the two. She managed his medications, which at various points numbered 11 and required a chart to keep straight. She cooked meals that met his dietary restrictions without making him feel he was eating around an illness. She fixed the gutters and the porch steps and the furnace igniter and the things that break in old houses on a schedule nobody plans for. She sat with him in the evenings while he watched the creek from the porch, the two of them quiet together in the way that people can be quiet when they have run out of the need to explain themselves to each other. Edwin did not thank her. That was not his way. He thanked her in the manner of people who are not accustomed to gratitude, obliquely, practically, by telling her things she didn't already know. He told her the history of the mill equipment and the names of the farms he'd served and what he'd charged and why. He told her about her grandfather and the decisions her grandfather had made about the creek property. He told her things he had apparently been waiting for someone to sit still long enough to hear. She listened. She filed it away in the careful, systematic way the archive training had given her, understanding without quite knowing why that the information would matter later. Her mother had died 18 months after Nora returned, pneumonia following a fall. Edwin had held on for 4 more years. Those years were harder than the first ones, not in the dramatic way that people expect hard things to be hard, but in the slow, steady way of a tide wearing at stone. She was 42 and then 43 and then 44, and she had given up the career she had built and the life she had been building, and nobody outside of this house on Harn Creek knew or would have known from looking at her, because she had not made it available to be known. She did not resent it. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind. She had made a choice and she had kept to it, and she would make the same choice again. But she had made it, and it had cost her, and the people who had not made it had lived their lives unimpeded during the years she was here. Claire came for Christmas twice. Paul came once for a long weekend when Edwin's cardiologist raised a concern, assessed the situation, and flew back to Atlanta. They called on Sundays, both of them, and asked how Edwin was doing. Nora told them. She was thorough and accurate and kept her tone, even because accuracy was what they needed, and she was not going to use her father's decline to argue a case she'd already made and lost. Edwin died on a Tuesday in October, the same season as the turning leaves, which he had always loved. He had been a man who liked October. He said once that October was the most honest month, everything showing exactly what it was. The estate attorney, a careful woman named Frances Wick who had handled Edwin's affairs for years, called Claire and Paul and Nora to the office 3 days after the funeral. Claire sat with her hands folded, wearing a coat Nora had never seen before. Paul sat to Claire's left with his phone face down on the table, which was the most considerate gesture he'd managed in 6 years. Frances Wick read the will. The house and its contents went to Claire, who had the larger family. The savings account, $41,000, 30 years of mill earnings and careful living, went to Paul, who had once mentioned student loans in a conversation Edwin had apparently remembered. The truck went to Paul as well. The mill property on Harn Creek, 4 acres including the mill pond, the mill race, the mill building and its equipment, and the creek bed parcel extending to the county road, went to Nora Ann Callum, sole heir of said property. Frances Wick noted that the mill property had been assessed at $2,200 in the most recent county appraisal. She noted that the wheel mechanism was in disrepair and would require significant work. She noted that the mill race had a structural issue near the headgate that had been deferred. She presented Nora with the deed, the property tax records, and a sealed envelope with Nora's name on it in Edwin's handwriting that had been left with the will. Nora put the envelope in her coat pocket without opening it. Claire's expression when the will reading concluded was the expression of a woman recalculating. Not angry exactly, recalibrating. She waited until Frances Wick stepped out to take a call. "He left you the mill," she said to Nora. "I know. The house is, we'll need to handle the contents. There are things I assumed. I don't want the contents, Claire. Paul and I were thinking the savings could be split 3 ways, since obviously the will is the will." Paul looked at the table. Claire looked at Nora with the particular look of someone who has been told something they were not expecting and is deciding whether to accept it. Nora stood up, put the deed in her bag, and left. She drove to the mill that afternoon. The access road was a half-mile of gravel that broke off from the county road and wound down through a stand of sycamore and hickory to the creek bottom. The trees were in their full October color, gold and copper, and the deep burgundy of the hickory leaves, and the light coming through them in the afternoon was the particular slanted light of fall in the mountains, long and amber. She had driven this road so many times in childhood that her hands turned at the right moments without being told. The mill sat at the bend where Harn Creek widened around a limestone shelf. Edwin had built the mill race when Nora was small, diverting the creek through a channel to the wheel, and the stone of the race was the same limestone that came out of the creek bed, blue-gray, wet, embedded with the fossils of small things. The mill building itself was timber frame, post and beam. the kind of construction that had been done the same way for 300 years. The timber was darkened with age, and the siding boards had shrunk in some places and warped in others, but the frame was sound. Edwin had kept the frame sound. The wheel was not sound. Nora stood on the creek bank and looked at it. The great overshot wheel, 12 feet in diameter, built from white oak on an iron axle, had stopped turning. She didn't know exactly when. The last time she'd seen it moving had been 3 or 4 years ago, before Edwin had gotten too unsteady to work the mill. Now the lower paddles were submerged in the mill pond, and growth had claimed the upper half. Wild grape and Virginia creeper had threaded through the spokes, and the wooden paddles were swollen and split with years of wet and dry cycles. The weight of the vines had pulled the wheel slightly off true so that it listed downstream, the axle groaning in its housing. Around the base of the wheel, where the mill race narrowed toward the wheel pit, vegetation had grown so thick it formed a solid mat. Sumac saplings, pokeweed, a volunteer sycamore no thicker than her wrist that had rooted itself directly in the headrace wall. The building was behind her, its door unlocked. She'd looked inside briefly, the millstones, the grain elevator, the flour bins, all still in place, all still his. His leather work apron on its hook by the door, his reading glasses on the window ledge, a tin cup he'd always kept on the workbench. She stood on the bank and looked at the wheel. It was the only thing left of his working life. The house would be repainted and redecorated and become Claire's house. The truck would go to Atlanta and become Paul's truck. The savings account would be dispersed into lives that hadn't been built here. But the wheel was here. The limestone mill race was here. The sound of the creek was the same sound she had heard from her childhood bedroom for 18 years and again for 6 years as an adult, and it had not changed at all. She was not going to sell this place. She had known it since Francis Wick read the deed. She just didn't know yet what she was going to do with it instead. She opened the envelope Edwin had left. Inside was one page, folded once in his deliberate handwriting, the handwriting of a man who had never been educated past high school but who had always written as if what he wrote should last. Nora, the mill is yours because you're the only one who'll understand what it was for. Not the grinding, the being there, the keeping the door open. I put something in the wheel housing for you in the headrace wall, inside the wheel pit, the last timber panel on the left when you're facing upstream. You'll have to clear the wheel to get to it. Take your time. It'll keep. It's kept this long. Dad, she read it twice. Then she put it back in her pocket and looked at the wheel. The morning was cold, the first real cold of the season, and the creek gave off a thin vapor in the early light. She was wearing her work coat. She had rubber boots in the truck. She went to get them. It took 4 days to clear the wheel, not because the work was beyond her. She had spent summers in this mill as a girl and knew how it was built, but because she did it right. She cut the vines by hand before she pulled them, so she wouldn't tear the paddles. She removed the volunteer sycamore with a hand saw, cutting at the root line and prying the root from the headrace stone with a bar. She worked in sections, from the rim inward, cleaning each paddle of its growth before moving to the next, keeping the pressure off the axle. Edwin had taught her that. He said a mill wheel, like most things, only looked like one piece. It was 100 pieces working together, and if you pulled one wrong, you pulled them all. On the first morning, before she'd been at it an hour, a truck pulled up at the top of the access road. The man who climbed out was big, not tall, but broad, moving slowly in the way of a man whose joints had put in their years. He wore a canvas coat and a cap with the logo of the Harn County Grain Co-op. He stood at the top of the bank and looked down at Nora in the creek margin with her loppers and her rubber boots. "Thought somebody was down here," he said. "Otto," Nora said. "Nora Callum." He said her name as if he were confirming something he'd expected to find. He came down the bank carefully, one hand on the sycamore trunks for balance, and stood beside her on the wet stones. He looked at the wheel, at the vines she'd cut, at the sycamore sapling in the bucket. "Clearing the wheel," he said. "That's the plan." He studied the wheel for a long moment. Otto Marsh had known Edwin Callum for 40 years, had brought his farm's grain to the mill every fall through the 1990s, had driven Edwin to his cardiologist appointments every other Thursday through the last year of his life. He had attended the funeral with his hands folded and his jaw set, The way men who don't cry in public keep themselves from crying in public. He kept saying he was going to do this himself, Otto said. Every spring. This spring I'm going to get that wheel cleared. Every spring he didn't. He waited for me. Otto looked at her. Suppose he did. He picked up the second pair of loppers she'd left on the bank. What do you want cut first? They worked through the morning together. Otto was methodical in the way that men who have worked with machinery for 50 years are methodical, taking his time, not rushing, thinking 3 steps ahead. He told her about the wheel's construction while they worked. The hub was cast iron, the spokes were white oak, the paddles had been replaced twice that he knew of, the last time in the late 1980s when Edwin had split and cured the lumber himself and fitted each paddle by hand. At noon Otto went to his truck and came back with a thermos and 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, which he set on a dry rock without ceremony. He talked about you, Otto said when they were sitting on the bank eating. What did he say? Said you gave up a good job to come back, said he told you not to and you came anyway. He poured coffee from the thermos. Said you were stubborn like your mother and that was the best thing about you. Nora looked at the wheel. He didn't leave you much, Otto said. It wasn't a judgment, it was just the facts stated the way Otto stated facts plainly without apology. He left me the mill. Claire got the house. The house is a house. This is, she stopped. She wasn't sure yet how to say what this was. This was his, everything else was just property. Otto was quiet for a while. He drank his coffee and looked at the mill pond, the thin skin of cold air above the water. He said something to me about 6 months before he died, Otto said. He said the mill had a longer memory than anyone in his family gave it credit for. He said the things that mattered were in the mill and not the house. He looked at Nora. I thought he was being sentimental. Maybe he wasn't. Nora thought about the letter in her pocket, about the panel in the headrace wall. He wasn't, she said. By the afternoon of the 4th day, the wheel was cleared. The last of the growth came off the downstream spokes in long, reluctant strands, and Nora stood in the wheel pit in rubber boots, the water cold at her ankles, and looked at the oak spokes stripped clean, the iron hub, the paddles still mostly sound despite the years of neglect. The wheel was not beyond repair. That surprised her. She had expected worse. She said as much to Otto when he arrived the next morning. Your father kept it oiled, Otto said. He set his sandwiches on the dry rock and looked at the wheel. Even when it wasn't turning, he came out here every spring and oiled every bearing and every joint. Said a wheel that wasn't turning was just waiting, not dying, and waiting things needed to be maintained. He looked at the paddles, white oak, dark with age and weather, the grain still tight, the fasteners holding. He dressed those paddles in 1988, Otto said. I watched him do it, took him a week. He said oak lasts if you treat it right. He turned to look at Nora. He treated everything right. 2 days after the wheel was clear, the first of the neighbors came. A woman named Rebecca, who had lived on the farm past the ridge for 30 years, arrived in her truck with a pot of soup and the straightforward manner of someone who does not offer sentiment but offers soup, which is more useful. She left the pot on the mill's workbench with a note that said, Edwin fixed our corn grinder 3 times for nothing. This doesn't cover it, but it's a start. A man named Lowell, who had driven grain to the mill in the 1990s when his family was still farming, came with his teenage son and asked if there was work to be done. Nora put them on the collapsed section of the south fence that had been down since the winter before Edwin died. They fixed it in an afternoon and refused payment. The son, who had barely spoken, looked at the wheel on his way out and said, Is it going to run again? Nora looked at the wheel. Yes, she said. She had decided it at that moment, not before. A retired schoolteacher named Ida brought firewood, stacked it against the mill's south wall without asking where it should go because she had clearly been deciding on the placement since before she arrived, and then sat with Nora on the creek bank with a thermos of tea, and told her about the year the mill had stayed open an extra week in November, so that the farms on the far side of the ridge could get their grain in before the road closed. Your father drove out to every farm and told them personally, Ida said. Went door to door. Nobody had to ask, he just knew who needed it. She paused, watching the water. He was like the creek, she said. The creek doesn't ask if you need water, it's just there. By the end of the 2nd week, the mill's front step had become a kind of station. People stopped on their way to and from the county road, left things, stayed for coffee when there was coffee. Some of them Nora recognized from childhood, and some of them she'd never met, people who had known Edwin through the mill, through the co-op, through the decades of a life lived in one place and kept with care. They came the way people come when something they had given up on turns out to still be there. A little tentative, a little relieved. She turned toward the headrace wall. Inside the timber frame housing around the wheel shaft, where the great axle passed through the wall and into the mill, the framing timbers were old and dark with age and oil. Edwin had always kept the shaft housing oiled. The timber was sound, and on the left side of the housing, facing upstream exactly as the letter had said, was a panel, not part of the original frame. You could see the difference in the wood. The panel was newer, fitted into the existing framing with precision, its edges sealed with linseed oil compound that had dried to the color of old amber. 4 carriage bolts, one at each corner, seated flush in countersunk holes. Nora found the socket wrench in the mill's tool cabinet, hanging on its hook exactly where Edwin had always kept it, outlined in black marker on the pegboard, the same system he'd used for every tool in every building he'd ever worked in. She unbolted the panel in the cold morning air, her hands steady. The bolts came out one at a time, and she set them in her coat pocket. The panel came free. Behind it, set into a cavity Edwin had cut in the stone of the headrace wall, was a wooden box cedar jointed at the corners, the lid secured with a brass latch. Dry inside the wall, the cold stone keeping it cool and stable. Beside the box, wrapped in oilcloth, a rolled document tied with butcher's twine. And resting on top of the box, set there deliberately, was a small object that stopped Nora's breath for a moment. It was a tin cup, not the one from the workbench. This one was older, smaller, dented on one side, with a wire handle wrapped in electrical tape that had dried and cracked with age. She recognized it. She had drunk water from this cup as a girl, standing in this exact wheel pit while Edwin showed her how the water moved from the headrace to the paddle, and from the paddle to the axle, and from the axle to the millstones. It was the cup he'd kept at the mill before she was born. He had taken it down from wherever it lived and set it here for her to find. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she sat down on the stone of the wheel pit wall and opened the cedar box. Inside, a ledger, dark green cover, cloth bound, the spine reinforced with a strip of black tape. 30 years of milling records in Edwin Callum's careful, unhurried handwriting. She opened it and read, March 1987, first full season. Ran the mill every day April through November. Toll gate rate, 1/8 of the grain standard. Most families paid in kind, flour, cornmeal. Hallbrook Farm paid in pork. That's fine. She turned pages. Spring entries, summer entries, the busy fall harvest weeks when the line of farmers with wagons stretched back up the access road. October 1989. Brought the Reston family's grain in twice this month. James Reston is sick, something with his heart. They don't know yet what. His wife Melvie brought the wagon both times, the daughter June sitting up beside her, maybe 6 years old, straight-backed and serious. I took the grain. I charged them nothing. Melvie tried to pay. I told her to bring what she could in the spring. She'll bring what she can and it won't be enough and that will be fine. November 1989. Milled for 4 families this week who are short. Running a tab for all of them. I know what they owe. I'll know when to call it even. The entries continued. Season after season, year after year. The farms of Harn County and the families who worked them, recorded in the patient hand of a man who measured his prosperity not by what he kept, but by what passed through. She was perhaps a third of the way through the ledger when she found the entry she hadn't expected. September 2001. Nora called from Raleigh today. She got the archivist position. She was trying not to sound too excited and not doing a very good job of it, which means she was very excited. She'll be good at it. She has my mother's way with documents, the patience for them, the belief that what's written matters. I told her congratulations and that I was proud of her. She said thank you the way she's always said it, like she means it exactly as much as she said. She kept reading. June 2015. Claire called today to ask about the mill property. She has a contact at a distillery in Asheville that is looking for a limestone water source. She says the limestone shelf under the mill pond might be what they need and that there's real money in it if we're interested in selling. I told her I wasn't. She said she just wanted to make sure I knew the option existed. I said I know what I have and I'm keeping it. She didn't push. I expect she'll come back to this. Nora sat very still. September 2016. Claire called again about the water source. A land acquisition agent from the distillery, a man named Burgess, has apparently made a formal offer. Claire says it's significant. She said something about my future care costs, and I told her to let me worry about my future care costs. I said the creek property is not for sale now or when I'm dead. She said I was being unreasonable. I said no. And then 2 years before he died, an entry dated in March. Saw Francis Wick yesterday to amend the will. The creek property goes to Nora specifically with mineral rights intact. I put this in writing because I know Claire will contest it and I want there to be no question. I explained my reasons to Francis and she wrote them down and I signed them. I want the record to be clear. This is my decision made clearly for reasons I understand. Nora gave up 6 years of her life to be here. She didn't ask me to. She just came. That's not a small thing. It's the whole thing. Nora set the ledger on her knee. She sat in the wheel pit with the creek running past her rubber boots and the cold morning coming through the gaps in the mill housing, and the smell of wet stone and leaf mold, and the very faint, permanent smell of flour that had been ground into the timbers of this building for 30 years. Her father had known. He had known about Claire's plan. He had known about the distillery's offer. He had documented his reasons and put them in a signed letter with his attorney and sealed the ledger in the wall of his own mill because he believed, as he had always believed, that the things that mattered should be written down. She set the ledger on the dry stone beside her and unrolled the oilcloth document. It was a copy of the property deed, and clipped to the deed was a separate document, a one-page letter, handwritten, dated 2 years prior. She recognized the handwriting but not the stationery. She read the heading, "To Francis Wick, Attorney at Law, Ray, Amendment to the Last Will and Testament of Edwin Callum. Francis, I am writing this by hand so there is a copy in my own words of why I am doing what I am doing. I want this kept with the will. I am leaving the mill property to Nora because she earned it, not in the legal sense, though I believe she did in that sense too, but in the sense that matters to me. She came home when I needed her and stayed when it was hard and never once made me feel like a burden. That is a gift I can never repay. Leaving her the mill is the closest I can come. I'm also leaving it to her because I know what Claire intends to do with it if she gets it. Claire wants to sell the creek property to the distillery. I understand her reasons. She thinks it's practical. But this property has been in this family for 60 years, and the limestone spring under that mill pond has been running clean water through this land since before any of us were born. I am not selling the reason this mill worked, and I don't want anyone selling it after I'm gone. If anyone later claims I was confused or coerced when I made this decision, I want them to read this letter. I am not confused. I am 71 years old and I know exactly what I have and exactly who I trust to keep it. That is Nora. Edwin Callum. She set that letter on the dry stone beside the ledger. There was one more thing in the cedar box. Underneath the ledger, folded separately in a smaller piece of oilcloth, was another letter. This one had only her name on the outside. No heading, no date, just Nora. In the same handwriting she had been reading in the ledger for the past 2 hours. She unfolded it. Nora, I have tried to write this 4 or 5 times and kept stopping because I couldn't find the beginning. So I'll start in the middle, which is where the true things usually are. You came back. I told you not to. I said go live your life, and you said I will, Dad, I am, and then you packed your apartment and drove home. I was too stubborn to tell you at the time that it was the best thing anyone had ever done for me. I am telling you now because I want you to know it and because I won't be saying it in person. I watched you every morning. You think I didn't. I watched you go through the day with the same deliberateness you always had. You were always a deliberate person, even as a girl. You thought before you spoke and meant what you said, and I understood that you had made a real decision, made it clearly, and were going to keep it. That was harder to receive than a resigned sacrifice would have been. It meant I couldn't tell myself you didn't know what you were giving up. You knew, you came anyway. The ledger in this box is 30 years of this mill's life. I want you to read it because I want you to understand what this place was, not the building, though I'm proud of the building. What I mean is the practice of it, the keeping the accounts, the knowing what families needed and what I could give and not making them choose between their dignity and their flour. I wasn't charitable. I was useful. There's a difference that matters. I have left you the limestone spring because someone will come for it and you need to say no with the deed in your hand. Say no clearly. The spring is why this mill runs. You don't sell the reason. I have left you the ledger because the record matters. Keep a record of your own. Whatever this mill becomes, and it will become something, I believe that, write it down. For the sake of whoever comes after you and finds it and needs to know that it meant something. I said I love you on Tuesdays because that seemed like the day that needed it most. Today is whatever day it is when you're reading this. Consider it a Tuesday. Dad Nora read the letter once. She did not read it a second time. Not yet. She folded it carefully, along the same creases he had made, and held it in both hands. She sat in the wheel pit with the creek running past her rubber boots, and the cold morning coming through the gaps in the mill housing, and the smell of wet stone and leaf mold, and the faint, permanent smell of 30 years of flour ground into the timbers of this building, absorbed into the grain of the wood the way some things absorb completely into the things that hold them. Her father had known. He had known about Claire's plan and the distillery's offer. He had known what Nora had given up to come home. He had documented everything carefully and sealed it in the wall of his own mill and trusted the building to hold it until the right person came. She pressed one hand flat against the stone of the wheel pit wall. Cold, dense, limestone, the same limestone that ran under the mill pond, the same water that had turned this wheel for 30 years. The wheel was going to turn again. Take a breath. What Nora found in that wheel housing is the reason her father left her this place and not the other things. Stay with me. The letter from Claire's attorney arrived on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the will reading. It was addressed to Nora Care of the mill property, which meant Claire's attorney had looked up the deed address, which meant Claire had been thinking about this since the reading. Nora opened it at the workbench, standing beside Edwin's apron. The letter alleged that Edwin Callum, at the time of the will amendment 2 years prior, had been under undue influence from Nora, who was his primary caregiver, and had both the opportunity and motive to manipulate his estate decisions. It requested that the amendment be set aside and the original will reinstated, which would distribute the estate, including the mill property, in equal thirds among the 3 children. There was a second document attached. A business card for a land acquisition agent at a firm called Blue Ridge Resources, LLC. On the back of the card, in Claire's handwriting, "Nora, this is the man I told Dad about. He's still interested. Call him before this gets expensive for everyone." See Nora set the card on the workbench beside Edwin's tin cup. She stood there for a moment. Then she went to find Otto. He was at the Grain Co-op office, doing what he was usually doing at 9 in the morning, which was drinking bad coffee and reading the county newspaper and waiting for something to need fixing. He read Claire's letter in the slow, thorough way he did most things, and then he set it on the desk and looked at Nora. "Undue influence," he said. "That's what she's claiming. You spent 6 years watching after your father and your mother and cleaning up everything they couldn't manage anymore, and you never once complained about it to me, and I saw you once a week for 2 years. He set the letter down. "That's not undue influence. That's the opposite of undue influence." "I know, but she only needs a judge to have questions." Otto tapped the letter. "Your father knew this would happen. That's why he wrote it down." "I know that too." He looked at her. "You need an attorney." "I know an attorney is expensive." "There's a woman in the county seat," Otto said. "Property law, young, but she knows what she's doing." He paused. "Her name is June Reston." Nora looked up. "The Reston family," she said slowly. "James Reston's daughter, yes, grew up on the farm over on Route 9. James had a heart thing, spent most of 1989 in the hospital. Your father milled for their family all that year, didn't charge them once." Otto picked up his coffee. "June knows about it. James told her when she was old enough to understand it. She came to your father's funeral. I saw her in the back row. Nora thought about the ledger entry. June sitting up beside her, maybe 6 years old, straight-backed and serious. She was serious still, apparently. "Call her," Otto said. June Reston was 38, with her father's straight back and a directness about her that made Nora immediately comfortable. She came to the mill the following afternoon, walked the property in her good coat with her hands in her pockets, listened to the whole situation without writing anything down, and then stood at the creek bank and looked at the wheel. "He left a letter with his attorney explaining his reasons," she said. It was not a question Nora had told her, but June was thinking through the structure of it. Signed, dated in his own handwriting, given to Francis Wick at the time of the amendment. "Claire will argue it was drafted under your influence." He drove himself to Francis Wick's office. He called and made the appointment himself. "Francis Wick has the records." June looked at the mill pond. The limestone shelf was visible through the clear water in the shallower sections near the bank. Blue-gray stone, old, the same stone the mill was built on. "The distillery has been trying to get this parcel for how long?" "Claire first mentioned it in 2015. That's in the ledger." June looked at her. "You have a ledger entry from 2015 documenting Claire's contact about the distillery, and 2016, and the letter Edwin wrote to Francis Wick in 2020 specifically stating that he knew about Claire's plan and was amending the will to prevent it." Nora looked at the water. "He wrote everything down." June was quiet for a moment. "I grew up knowing your father milled our grain the year my father was sick," she said. "He never charged us. My father offered to pay in the spring, and Edwin told him the account was clear. My dad spent years trying to understand why. He never did, really." She picked up a piece of limestone from the bank, turned it in her hands, set it back down. "I came to your father's funeral because I wanted to, not for a case, not for anything except that. I know. But I'd like to take this case, not for free. I have a practice to run, but at a rate you can manage." She turned to look at Nora. "Your father built something honest. It should stay in honest hands." The mill race was the problem Nora found the following week, and it was a serious one. She had known the race had a structural issue. Francis Wick had flagged it in the property documents, but she had not understood the extent until Dessau helped her pull the overgrowth from the channel wall near the headgate. Dessau had appeared at the mill on a Monday morning with a pair of work gloves and a direct question. Did Nora need help, and was there pay in it? She was 24, recently laid off from the county's last remaining manufacturing plant, with calloused hands and a way of looking at machinery that reminded Nora of Edwin, not impatient, just attentive, as if she were listening to what the equipment was saying. Nora had said yes to both. They found it together, a section of the mill race wall, maybe 8 feet long, where the old limestone mortaring had failed. The stones had shifted inward and the channel was losing water into the hillside. You could see the damp patch on the outside of the bank, the wet seep that had been there for years without anyone diagnosing it. Fixing it properly, pulling the failed section, relaying the stones, repointing the whole length would cost $4,000 in materials alone, more if she hired the labor. Nora had $600 in her checking account. She had no job, she had no income. She had 2 years of caregiving behind her and savings nearly gone and a will contest ahead of her that would cost money she didn't have. She sat on the creek bank in the November cold and did the arithmetic. It did not resolve in her favor. Dessau sat beside her without saying anything for a while. Then, what did the mill race look like before it failed? Same as the rest of the channel, limestone mortared. "So it's a repoint job mostly. The stones are still there. Most of them. I've done masonry work, not mill masonry, but the principles are the same." Dessau looked at the failed section. "If I do the labor and we source the lime mortar from the co-op, the material cost comes down to maybe $800, give or take." Nora looked at her. "I'm not working for free," Dessau said. "I'm working for fair wages, and the going rate on masonry is what it is. But if we do it ourselves, it's $3,000 cheaper than hiring out." Nora thought about the ledger, about the way Edwin had kept the long account, not calculating advantage, just doing the math of what was in front of him and trusting things to balance over time. "All right," she said. The work took 10 days. Cold days mostly, the creek running high with November rain, the mortar setting slowly in the damp air. Dessau worked with the steady precision Nora had suspected she had, and Nora worked beside her and learned what she didn't know and relearned what she'd forgotten. Otto came twice with sandwiches and leaned on the bank railing and made suggestions that were almost always correct. By the time they finished, the channel was sound. The water ran true. The morning after the mill race repair was done, Nora went inside the mill and stood at the millstones. They were French Boer stones, 4 feet in diameter, the upper stone dressed in a radial pattern that Edwin had maintained by hand every few years. She set her palm flat on the upper stone. It was cold, but the machinery around it, the shaft, the gears, the wooden pit wheel in the floor was intact. Edwin had kept the interior in working order long after the mill had stopped running commercially. He had oiled and turned and adjusted and maintained it alone, because he believed in keeping things ready. She climbed up to the grain elevator and looked down through the building. She thought about what a working mill needed that she had: the wheel, the stones, the race, the water. She thought about what a working mill needed that she didn't have yet: customers, grain, a reason to turn the wheel that someone would pay for. She had an idea. It was small and uncertain and would take time. Heritage grain varieties, red Fife wheat, heirloom cornmeal, specialty rye. The kind of thing the chefs in Asheville had been asking about for years, the kind of thing that required a stone mill to do properly, the kind of thing that no commercial operation was doing in this end of the state. Edwin's millstones could do it. They had been doing it, the same principle applied to specialty grain as to any other. The difference was the market, and the market existed if you knew where to find it. She went to find ça. The hearing was in November, 6 weeks after June Reston had filed the response to Claire's challenge. Nora drove to the county seat in the truck she'd borrowed from Otto, who had offered without being asked. The morning was clear and cold, the last of the fall color gone from the ridges, the hills the brown and gray of late November. She drove without the radio, listening to the sound of the road. She had the deed, Edwin's letter to Francis Wick in a document folder, and the ledger June had told her to bring the ledger. It was not strictly legal evidence of Edwin's state of mind, but it was the record of who he was, and a judge was allowed to understand who someone was. She had not told anyone to come. June had prepared thoroughly. She had Francis Wick's written statement confirming that Edwin had scheduled and attended the amendment appointment independently, had been fully coherent, and had presented the letter of explanation voluntarily. She had the amendment itself, properly witnessed and notarized. She had a timeline demonstrating that Edwin's decision had been preceded by years of documented deliberation. The ledger entries from 2015 and 2016, the distillery contact, the explicit refusal. The decision was not reactive. It was the conclusion of a process that had run 4 years before the will was ever amended. And she had Edwin's letter, 2 pages in his own hand, clear and specific, naming the pressures around him and explaining precisely why he was doing what he was doing. It was not the letter of a confused man. It was the letter of a man who had spent his life writing things down because he believed that what was written lasted, and who had applied that belief to the most important document he would ever leave. The courtroom was small. 20 seats in the gallery, most of them taken. Otto was there. He had put on his good coat and the plaster dust from the mill work was brushed off the sleeve. Desas sat beside him with her hands folded, upright, watching the front of the room. Ribot was there, the woman who had brought the soup, and Lowell, who had brought his son to fix the fence. Ida, the retired schoolteacher. A man named Bernard whose family was in the ledger from 1991, a drought summer milling credit extended and never called. He had driven 40 minutes to be in the room. Francis Wick was present in person, which June had not expected and Nora had not asked for. She sat in the front row of the gallery with her hands in her lap and her expression professionally neutral, the expression of an attorney who has made her statement in writing and is present now purely as a matter of principle. And in the back row sat James Reston, June's father, 74 years old, 40 miles from his farm, present without being asked, in a room where he had no legal standing and every human reason to be. Nora did not know he had come until she sat down and June leaned in and said quietly, "My father's in the back. He wanted to be here." Nora did not look. She would not have been able to hold herself together if she had looked. Claire sat at the plaintiff's table with Hartley, her attorney, who had the smooth competence of someone accustomed to straightforward estate disputes. He had not anticipated the letter. The letter was the problem with his case, and Nora could see from the way he organized his papers too many times, too carefully, that he understood this. The judge read the documents in the sustained quiet of someone who is not performing thoroughness but actually practicing it. She read Edwin's letter to Francis Wick in full. She read the amendment language. She read Francis Wick's statement. She read the 2 ledger entries June had submitted as exhibits. She set the papers down. "Mr. Hartley," she said, "the undue influence claim requires that the testator lacked independent will at the time of the amendment. This letter," she held it up, "was prepared by the decedent independently, deposited with his attorney, and contains a clear, specific, and internally consistent account of his reasoning. He names the external pressures. He names the person he is trying to protect. He names his reasons." She looked at Hartley over her glasses. "What is the evidence that this was not his own decision?" Hartley offered his argument. Edwin's age, his health, Nora's position as primary caregiver, the proximity of influence. The judge listened to all of it. "His age at the time of the amendment was 71, she said. "His letter is coherent. The attorney who received it describes him as fully present and acting independently. The letter itself demonstrates knowledge of a sustained real estate pressure from a family member and a considered decision to prevent it." She set the letter down. "Counsel, you are describing proximity, not undue influence. They are not the same." She looked at Claire's table. "The challenge is denied," she said. "The will amendment stands as written. The mill property and all associated parcels, including mineral rights, are the sole property of Nora Ann Callum per the decedent's will." She banged the gavel once. In the gallery, Otto exhaled the long, slow exhale of a man who has been holding something for weeks and is finally allowed to set it down. Dessau unclasped her hands. Ida touched the sleeve of the woman beside her. Bernard, who had driven 40 minutes, nodded once at the floor at the specific angle of a man who is privately satisfied. At the back of the room, James Reston bowed his head. Nora sat still for a long moment. Then she breathed. June gathered the documents without ceremony, the quiet efficiency of someone who had prepared for this and is now simply completing what she prepared for. She touched Nora's arm briefly. Not much, just a touch. Outside the courthouse, the November air was cold and clear, and the mountains were every shade of brown and gray on the ridgelines, going back in layers to the horizon. Nora stood on the steps and breathed the air and let the county around her be what it was. James Reston came down the steps behind her. He stopped beside her and they looked at the mountains together for a moment. "Your father milled our grain the year I was sick," he said. "I told him in the spring I'd pay him what we owed. He told me the account was clear." He was quiet for a moment. "I never understood why." "He thought it was just what you did," Nora said. James nodded. "June says the same thing now. When she takes a case for someone who can't pay, she says the same thing." He looked at the mountains. "I suppose it passes down." He shook her hand and went to find his daughter. Nora drove home. The mill opened in the spring. Not for grain in the old commercial way. The farms that had needed weekly milling 30 years ago had consolidated or quit or found other arrangements. What Edwin's mill became was something Nora had worked through over the winter at the kitchen table with Dessau and Otto and a notepad. A heritage milling operation producing specialty stone ground flour for restaurants and bakeries in Asheville and in the smaller towns across the county. Red Fife wheat, heirloom cornmeal, a coarse rye from a farm 2 counties over that had been growing the old variety for 60 years and hadn't known anyone still wanted it until Nora called. Sold at the farmers' market on Saturdays and through standing orders with 6 restaurants that had been asking around for exactly this. A local stone mill, water-powered, old stones that ground slow and cold and didn't destroy the grain in the doing. The limestone spring was not sold. The distillery's agent sent a second letter in February. Nora wrote back 3 sentences. "The property is not for sale. The mineral rights are not for sale. Please direct future inquiries to June Reston's office." She sent the letter the same day she received his. Dessa stayed. She had come for day wages in November and stayed because the mill needed someone who could understand what the machinery was saying, and she could understand it the way some people understand language. Not by learning the rules, but by ear, intuitively, the way you learn the sound of water running true versus water running wrong. By February, she had rebuilt the wooden gear train from Edwin's own notes, which she had found in the tool cabinet and read with the careful attention of someone studying something that would matter. She had relearned the dressing of the millstones from a manual she ordered, and from watching Nora watch the stones and from asking questions until the answers made sense. Nora gave her a wage that was fair, a room above the mill office that was warm, and the title of mill manager. Dessa said the title was too much. Nora said it was exactly right, and the conversation was done. They ran the mill together from the first Saturday in April, which was cold and clear, the sycamores in new leaf along the creek, the water running high and fast and cold from the spring rains. Nora held the gate lever that controlled the mill race flow and watched the water fill the headrace and reach the wheel and the wheel begin to turn slowly, feeling its own weight, the white oak paddles dark and gleaming in the morning light, and then the shaft turning and the gear train engaging and the stones beginning to move, slow and massive and exact. The sound of it was the sound she had heard from her bedroom for 18 years and again for 6 more, and had thought she might never hear again when she walked into this wheel pit in November and found the vines growing through the spokes. She stood at the gate lever and let the wheel turn. Otto was on the creek bank with his coffee. Dessa was in the mill house monitoring the stones. Reba and her husband were standing at the top of the bank watching. The retired schoolteacher Ida had brought her grandchildren who were watching the wheel with their mouths open. James Reston was there. June had brought him. He stood on the bank beside Otto and watched the wheel turn with the expression of a man watching something he had believed was gone and has found out was just waiting. Nora came out of the wheel pit and stood beside him on the bank. "My father kept it oiled," she said, "even when it wasn't running." "I know," James said. "Otto told me. He came out here every spring. He watched the wheel, the paddles lifted and caught and spilled, the sound of it carrying down the creek. That's the sound I grew up with, that sound." He was quiet for a moment. "I drove past this mill for 20 years and that wheel wasn't turning and I never stopped. I should have stopped." "You're here now," Nora said. He looked at her. Then he looked back at the wheel. "Yes," he said, "I am." The farmer's market that first Saturday had a line before she opened the table. Word had moved through the county the way word moves in small counties, quietly, completely, person to person and farm to farm. People came who had bought flour from Edwin in the 1990s. People came who had heard about the mill from their parents. A woman drove 40 minutes from the next county because someone had told her there was a stone mill running again on Harn Creek, and she wanted to see it for herself. Nora sold out by 9:30. She came home that afternoon and stood in the mill and looked at the empty flour bins with something she hadn't felt in a long time, a specific satisfaction that came from making something people needed and finding out it was wanted. She thought about Edwin at the toll gate in October, farmers bringing their harvest grain in wagons, the mill running 6 days a week, the ledger filling up with names and amounts, and the occasional notation about why an account was being carried. She thought about what he had written, the practice of it, the keeping the accounts. She went and found a new ledger at the hardware store, same size as his, same style. She brought it back to the mill and set it on the workbench beside the old one. She opened it and wrote the date. She wrote the first farm's name and the variety and the agreed toll and the standing order terms. She wrote Dessa's name in the front matter under her own, the way you write a partner's name. She wrote it in the same careful hand she had learned from watching Edwin write, not imitating him, just meaning what she wrote. Otto came to the official opening on a Saturday in April. He stood at the bank and watched the wheel turn in the creek water, the paddles catching and lifting and spilling, the sound of it the old sound that Nora had heard from her childhood bedroom. He didn't say much. He had his coffee. He watched the wheel turn for a long time. "I told your father," he said eventually, "that somebody should fix that wheel. About 5 years ago, he said somebody would." He drank his coffee. Turns out he was right. June Reston brought her father to the opening. James Reston was 74, slower than his daughter but present in the way that people who have been sick and recovered are present, attentive to things other people pass over, deliberate with what they say. He stood in the mill doorway and looked at the stones, the gear train, the flour bins. He looked at the ledger on the shelf. Nora had put it there when she opened, behind a glass pane Edwin had used for displaying old millstone patterns where it could be seen but protected. He read it through the glass for a long time. He turned to Nora. "He never said why," James said. "Your father. I asked him once why he milled for us that year and he said there wasn't anything to say about it. I never understood that." He looked back at the ledger. "I think I do now." "He thought it was just what you did." "He did," Nora said. James put his hand out. She shook it. He had his daughter's straight back and his daughter's direct eyes and the hands of a man who had worked his own land for 50 years. He held her hand a moment longer than a handshake required. "Thank you," he said, "for keeping it." In June, Claire came to the mill. Nora did not know she was coming. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon without calling, in the same coat she'd worn to the estate reading, and stood at the top of the access road for a long moment before she came down. Nora was at the millstones when she heard the door. She came out into the afternoon light and saw her sister standing in the mill yard, looking at the wheel. The wheel was turning. The water was running through the race and lifting the paddles in the long, patient rotation that Nora had been watching for months now and had not yet stopped finding remarkable. The sound of it was the sound of Harn Creek and the sound of the limestone and the sound of the building and the sound of 30 years of her father's work, all of it continuous, all of it still. Claire looked at it for a long time. "He kept it running," she said. "All those years." "He kept it ready," Nora said. "There's a difference." Claire turned. Her face was not what Nora had expected. It was tired. It was the face of a woman who had made a calculation and found out too late that the math she'd used had been the wrong kind. "I didn't know about the letter," Claire said, "to Francis. I didn't know he'd written it all down. He wrote everything down. I thought—" Claire stopped. She looked at the wheel again. "I thought it was just a building." Nora didn't say anything to that. There was nothing useful to say. They stood for a while in the yard while the wheel turned and the creek moved and the late afternoon light came through the hickory trees on the ridge and landed gold on the wet stone of the mill race. Eventually, Claire said she had to get back. She walked up the access road to her car. She did not apologize. But she came, and she looked at the wheel, and Nora thought that might be its own kind of accounting. That evening, after Dessau had locked the machinery and Otto had gone home and the last of the afternoon customers had left, Nora sat in the mill with the door open and the sound of the creek coming through it. She had Edwin's ledger open on the workbench beside her. She had a new ledger beside it, same size, same style, bought at the hardware store in town, and she was transferring the notes she'd been keeping since November into something more permanent. The farms she'd contracted with. The grain varieties and the tolls, the accounts that were running and the ones she'd offered to extend when the season was tight. She wrote in the same careful hand Edwin had used, not because she was trying to imitate him, but because she had learned from him that writing deliberately was a way of meaning what you wrote. She wrote, April 2024, first full season. The Hallbrook Farms grandson brought in heritage red fife, first planting. She wrote, the Reston family's daughter June has standing order for stone ground cornmeal, 2 bags per month. She wrote, Dessau Kane, mill manager. She can hear what the machinery says. She paused and looked at the mill around her. At the millstones, cold and still now that the wheel had stopped for the night. At the grain elevator's timber framing, dark with age and oil. At Edwin's leather apron on its hook by the door. His reading glasses on the window ledge. The tin cup from the wheel pit, which she had brought in and set on the workbench where it would stay. 3 objects, the apron, the glasses, the cup, the things he had left in the places where he kept them, where they had always been, where they would stay because they belonged there, and this was where things that belonged somewhere were kept. She wrote one more line in the new ledger. The relic trio stays on the shelf. The wheel turns. The spring runs. She closed the new ledger and set it beside Edwin's on the shelf. The mill wheel turned outside in the dark, steady and unhurried, lifting the water and releasing it, turning the shaft, moving the stones, doing what it had always done in the patient way that water and stone and the weight of a careful life tend to do things. A mill doesn't make anything. It changes what's already there into what it was always meant to be. Edwin Callum had known that. He had worked in that understanding for 30 years. He had built the wheel and dressed the stones and kept the accounts and sealed the ledger in the wall and written the letters and left the cup by the door and oiled the wheel every spring and waited for someone to come and find out what it was all for. Nora locked the mill at dusk and walked up the access road to the house where she had lived with her parents and where she lived now, with the creak sound in every room and the smell of stone flour in her coat and the ledger on the shelf and the wheel still turning in the dark below. She was 44 years old. She had a mill. She had the long account to keep. She was just getting started. EOF.